Well, here we are in session 85 of our study in Mark, looking this time at chapter 15, verses 1 through 5 of Mark. But we'll also bring up in Luke in chapter 23 and in John chapter 18. So we're going to go to those places. Probably we'll even find a way to bring in Matthew. We titled this particular section Before Pilate, in the sense of being in front of Pilate, being interrogated, as he was in front of Annas, as he was in front of Caiaphas, as Jesus was in front of the Sanhedrin. So now we're going to begin the Roman trial period, and it's going to take place in 3 interviews or 3 sections. I think we've mentioned this before. First, Pilate's interview, where Pilate gets this thing on the road. Then he's going to ship Jesus to Herod Antipas, who will interview Jesus. Herod will ship him back to Pilate. Pilate will do a further interview and come to a decision. Well, to finish our look at the Roman process, we're going to focus again on all four Gospels, piecing them together to get a full picture. No single Gospel gives the full picture. So while we're studying Mark, we're actually going to supplement Mark heavily. During this period, we're going to get a psychological profile of Pilate, such as the fact that Pilate is weak and vacillating. 3 times he declares Jesus innocent, as those multiple syllable words again. Even multiple is multiple syllable, isn't it? And as is syllable. Well, enough for the jocularity. Even though Pilate's 3 times going to tell the Jews, hey, this guy, there's nothing to make him, to prove he's guilty of anything, Pilate will not release Jesus. We know that. We know the story. Pilate will cover up what he's doing by his stubbornness and his violence. In this case, he's easily angered, and he turns toward the Jews. He taunts them, he goads them. He's trying to give the Jews a hard time, as they are, he feels, giving him a difficult time. After all, this is the Jews' problem, not Pilate's. But the Jews are making the Jesus problem Pilate's problem. That doesn't sit well. It's not well thought of. Pilate isn't well thought of by Caesar, and he operates out of fear for his career. It's going to lead to his giving in to the Jewish commands, even though there's no legal reason that he should. He's going to fear Jewish uprisings and the potential for Jewish complaints to Caesar. Remember, Pilate is not sitting well with the Caesar and the government, so he has to walk a very tight line in his thought process anyhow. He has to walk a fine time line. The scriptures reveal very little about what Pilate knew of all of these goings on up to this point. He may or may not have known what the Jews have been doing, what their conspiracy is, and why they're trying to get rid of Jesus. I personally suspect he knew more than Scripture tells us. And I think there are reasons we can go in that direction. So, we can but we can be sure of more, that he knew something of Jesus' popularity. I mean, he would keep track of what was going on in the country. He would know that Jesus has been drawing crowds, and he probably has some idea of what Jesus has been teaching and preaching. And he certainly would have known something about the triumphal entry into Jerusalem. And he also knew of the religious leaders' contempt for my Roman occupation. He knows the Jews hate his guts. He knows the propensity of the Jewish people to resist Roman rule, and he has to keep a lid on that. He was probably, I suspect, informed about Jesus' arrest before it took place. I suspect that the Jews probably came to him and said, here's what we're going to do. And he had some idea probably of why they felt they needed to. But we'll look a bit at that later. The presence of the Roman soldiers at Jesus' arrest. Remember the two groups mentioned were the temple guard and some of the Roman soldiers. So if he had soldiers there, he would have interrogated them too to find out what was going on. Pilate is stubborn. He's easily angered. He's uptight. He's fearful, but he isn't utterly stupid. The explanation that he would have gotten about the arrest would have at least claimed the possibility of an uprising or insurrection because of Jews. He knew the Jews feared Jesus for some reason. Keep in mind that while the Jewish trials focused on whether Jesus planned to destroy the temple and replace it, remember from early John, they mistook when he said, destroy this temple and in 3 days I'll raise it. They probably figured that he was going to try and end worship in the temple by destroying it, and then he was going to build another temple, probably feel that he is certainly bragging by saying he could do it in 3 days, that when he did bring in the new temple, he would bring in a new method or way of worshiping God, and it wouldn't be Yahweh's ordained way. So, maybe Pilate knew all of that, maybe he did not. We do not know. The Jewish trials focused on, if not the destruction of the temple, it focused on the problem of blasphemy. Remember that came about when Jesus claimed to be both Messiah, which in the Jewish eyes meant purely man, and he then also declared himself divine as the Son of God. And so the Jews are saying, put those two together, a man claiming to be God, blasphemy. And that, of course, was a death sentence, and that's what the Jews wanted. They wanted a death sentence, but they did not want that carried out in the Jewish tradition of stoning. He had to die on the cross. Neither that about destroying the temple, nor that of being God, neither of those charges fit Rome's requirements for a death sentence. That's purely a Jewish thing. You Jews, you have your God, you deal with him in however you see fit, but don't bug us. We're not worried about your God or your gods, if they thought Jews certainly had multiple gods as well. And of course, we know the Jews routinely sent themselves to worship false gods. So, when push came to shove, the Jewish charges had to include either something like sedition, treason, insurrection, something that was going to cause a serious uprising against Rome. And if they were going to get Pilate's attention, they're going to have to go that way, even though their entire trial of Jesus had none of that in it. We'll see how that plays out in a few moments. When the chief priests, which was the group leading this mob, and remember this was in early morning when the Sanhedrin met and said, this guy's got to go to Pilate. So when the chief priests and that mob, and it probably was not a huge mob, but a mob nonetheless, and this would have been the morning of what day? 15 Nisan, which was the beginning of Passover. Eventually, the Jews are going to put 3 charges against Jesus to Pilate. First, that Jesus claimed to be king of Israel. And he did. By claiming to be Messiah, he claimed to be king. Jesus then also, however, they said, claimed to be the Son of God. And that seems like it's strange and wouldn't fit the need that Pilate would have, but it turns out to have an effect in it nonetheless. Remember, Romans had many gods who appeared as people and had people-like characteristics. So that's not entirely outside of Pilate's concern. And finally, they're going to say, you know, he's been spreading dissension all the way from Galilee. And Galilee is a key here. Why? Who rules Galilee and Perea? Herod Antipas. So, if we're going to reconcile all 3 of the synoptic gospels, and as well as John's gospel, taking all 4, it's going to take some work. It's going to take some time. It's going to take probably 6, 8, 9 times through this section to and on the cross. It's going to be several possible sequences, and this is typical in a sequence of activities. What was the precise order and timing? And sometimes we don't know exactly, but we try to show that some sequence is possible, is logical, is consistent. We need to be able to show that to prevent people from screaming, contradiction, contradiction. If we can show that a sequence is reasonable and logical, then it is possible. You cannot claim that you have found and proved a contradiction. You can scream all you want to about it, but you can't verify it. Just as we can't verify that the sequence we put forth is necessarily the accurate, actual, real sequence. That's not the point. The point is to stop claims of proved contradictions. Well, what is the sequence of activities that we're going to be faced with? Well, part of it is the fact that Pilate is going back and forth between the Jews outside the praetorium and Jesus inside the praetorium. So he's oscillating back and forth between these guys to get a picture. We don't know how many times Jesus was taken in and out of the praetorium. We don't know the number of floggings and mockings for sure. We know there was at least one, but there could easily have been two sets. So there are things we don't know for sure, but we do know that mockings took place. We know that beatings took place, but we do not know how many times and so forth. But all we need to do is to understand that these things happened. Now, any differences in sequences are really of little concern, as I mentioned ago. We do know enough things to make this picture accurate and real. Pilate did rotate between negotiating with the Jews on the outside of the praetorium and interrogating Jesus inside the praetorium. That there was a sequence of actions that carried out this first segment. Jesus was mocked and subjected to physical abuse before being sent to Calvary. How many times? Not sure, but at least once. Pilate did make multiple attempts to declare Jesus without condemnable guilt and tried to free him 2 or 3 times as well. So those things we know, the exact sequence and full number of comings, goes, and so forth, we're not sure of. But for now, let's begin as the Jewish, or where the Jewish part of the trials was over and the Roman portion about to begin. And this is referring to the early morning, probably 5:36 or so. It would have been after sunup, so that this was 15 Nisan. Actually, not only in Jewish counting, which would have happened back at 6 o'clock the evening of the 14th of Nisan. So the first day of Passover has begun, and John 18:28 tells us, then they, and that would be the Jews who have been interrogating Jesus all night, brought Jesus from Caiaphas' house, we reckon, to the Roman governor's residence. So now they've had the Sanhedrin, and so maybe this wasn't from Caiaphas' house, but they've just come from the Sanhedrin, which would likely have been in the temple. So from Caiaphas may mean that Caiaphas wasn't present here. They brought Jesus from the presence of Caiaphas to the presence of the Roman governor at his residence. And we don't know precisely where that was. John 18:28 goes on. Now it was very early morning, like I said, 5:30 to 6 probably. They, the Jews, did not go into the governor's residence, which we've been calling the praetorium, so they would not be ceremonially defiled. Why? What's this got to do with anything? Well, if they were ceremonially defiled, they could not eat the Passover meal later that day. And why would they be ceremonially defiled? That's one of the Pharisees' deals. You go into the presence of a Gentile or in a Gentile's house or a Gentile's business of place of business, you might touch something that will defile you. Or the Gentiles quite often buried their dead underneath the flooring of the house. So you'd be walking where there were dead. So they might have touched something, or something might have touched them, and they would have become defiled. They could not eat the Seder. So they did not want to go in and run that risk. They'll stay outside, separate from Pilate. They're not going to touch Pilate either. They'll stay out there where they're safe and they can eat the meal. Kind of interesting. They're setting up to railroad a guy to be executed, and they're worried about being defiled by touch. Interesting. But that's the way they dealt. The time Jesus was being transferred to Pilate is, again, early morning, perhaps around 6 o'clock. Why would they try to get there that early? Well, Roman officials are known to have preferred very early morning for trials in order to be finished by noon. Don't want to have a trial interfering with your lunch. Sunrise, which would be the earliest starting time for the Sanhedrin's trial, would likely be between 5:30 and 6. So, for that reason, number one, it would probably have to be after the Sanhedrin legally met, which is said 5:30 to 6, and as early as they could get there, because Roman officials like to begin about 6. So, they were looking out for maximum effect, I suspect. That's a question for you. The phrase, brought Jesus from Caiaphas, was it from Caiaphas' residence or from his presence? And as I mentioned a moment ago, probably it refers to Caiaphas' presence, since the final trial segment should have taken place in the temple. If that's the case, and I'm right, which I may not be, but if I am, then Caiaphas is not present. The chief priests are there, but not the high priest. Caiaphas himself by name does not arise during these sessions. So that's another reason to ask if Caiaphas was actually present. But anyhow, we don't know for sure. I suspect he was not there. Earlier, I referred to the site, what was called here the governor's residence, as a praetorium, as do several translations. That would have a military setting, of course. One set of scholars believe that it was the Antonio Fortress, which is just a bit above, I think north from the temple grounds, and overlooks the temple grounds so that the soldiers could be observing what's going on around the temple in case they needed to act. Another set of scholars favors Herod's old castle in another part of Jerusalem. Now, typically, neither Pilate nor Herod would have been in Jerusalem. I say that, but of course, why would they have been there now? Well, because it was Passover. The Romans would have feared the Jews would have feared becoming unclean by something that might be in the Gentile house or something they might touch in the house. Such an act rendered a Jew unclean, as we mentioned a minute ago. His purification could render him ineligible to eat the Seder later that same day, and possibly unclean for most of the activities of the 8-day sacred festival, Passover and unleavened bread. None wished to miss the celebration. So it was that kind of thing. Keep in mind, this entire sequence of events began on Nisan 14 during the afternoon, and it made its way through the evening of Nisan 14, which would be, according to Jewish reckoning, 15 Nisan, the beginning of Passover week, and now it is definitely early in the morning on Nisan 15. So, where does that leave Pilate? Well, as we mentioned earlier, it leaves him shuffling outside to speak with the Jews, then back inside to interview Jesus privately, and then back out to the Jews, back and forth. This likely galled Pilate. Why? Because he would have sensed Roman superiority over the Jews, and it would have offended that aspect. You Jews are making me do this. You Jews don't make me do anything. But the Roman official tolerated, I suspect, in hope of avoiding any significant upheaval. He did not want bad reports getting back to Rome. Pilate apparently began from within the residence where Jesus had been brought to him, and then went outside to confront the chief priests and the Jewish mob. There's some question about this mob. Were they people sympathetic to Jesus or not? Well, they don't turn out eventually to support Jesus, but some of the wording tells us that there may have been some Jesus supporters present, but that's never brought up or mentioned, so like many things, we don't know. Since it was likely about 6 a.m., that Jewish mob was probably fairly small. How many people are going to get up to be somewhere at 6 o'clock in the morning for a trial? And it was easily controllable, if it's small, easily controllable by whom? The chief priests, who are the villains in this whole thing, this whole day. Where did the confrontation begin and when? Well, let's look at verse 29 of John 18. It began when Pilate came out of the residence, praetorium, fortress, whatever it was. When Pilate came outside to them, the Jews, the chief priests, and said, "What accusation do you bring against this man?" I think as we go further, you're going to get the impression these Jews thought that Pilate was simply going to rubber stamp whatever they asked him to do. I think they feel or felt that they had him in that tight a place that he would have to follow their wishes. But let's personalize it. Who had the lead in this session before Pilate? Well, I said earlier that I doubted that Caiaphas is present. But as a high priest, whether he was physically present or not, he would have been in charge. So wherever we read Jews, chief priests, and so on, think Caiaphas, perhaps in the background somewhere, but Caiaphas was the one with the power. We're not told if he was present, as I mentioned earlier, but even if he weren't present, his presence would be felt as if it were real. The Roman process for a trial typically went something like this. First, an indictment. And this is what Pilate was doing. What charges do you bring for against this man? What are you charging him with? Second step, Pilate will interrogate the defendant privately. So after he gets this list of charges, he's going to go back in and talk with Jesus. Then, after he talks with Jesus, he's going to come out and take testimony from two sources, witnesses and defendant. We doubt that there are significant witnesses about any particular act or event in this mob, but that's why he's coming back to talk to the Jews to take their testimony. Then he go back in and talks with Jesus to get his testimony. And that, at times, that proves a little bit iffy. Then he's going to have a consultation with legal advisors. He's going to go and see, all right, you guys, what do you see? What happened? Where do we go from here? After that, he would come out with a verdict, and a sentence would be announced, or innocence would be announced. And then whatever sentence was announced would be immediately carried out. So if Pilate comes back at the end and says this man is guilty, then he's going to take him to the cross immediately. There'll be no delays except for doing the flogging and such before. Well, the Jews clearly sought Pilate's approval of their wishes. So what was the Jews' first and most important tactic? Get Pilate to rubber stamp the Sanhedrin's verdict that he had to die. Jesus has to die. That's how we're going to get rid of our Jesus problem. Pilate, however, wasn't about to oblige this bunch of Jews. He's going to choose to conduct a new trial. He had no wish to be a rubber stamp for the Jews. So, let's check on the statement of charges that were given at this indictment, and this is the third verse in John 18, verse 30. So this is the third verse that we've looked at. They replied, as the chief priest replied, if this man were not a criminal, we would not have handed him over to you. What are they saying? Hey, don't give us that bull. You're not going to conduct a trial. We've said he's guilty. Take care of it. That response is just pure Jewish arrogance. It wasn't a charge. It wasn't an indictment. They just said, we brought him to you so you could kill him. Kill him. Pilate, however, was having none of it, at least not at this point in time. He may have previously known Jesus was not guilty of any capital crime, at least any capital crime as far as the Romans were concerned, and he knew the Jews would come with a capital crime. So, he says, you haven't given it to me yet. I'm not going to just take your word on it. But Pilate has to play this game out with the Jews. So the chief priests probably thought the procedure would be a slam dunk. Otherwise, their response wouldn't have been so smart-alecky. Such a discussion likely took place even before Jesus' arrest. Like I said, I would suspect that Caiaphas made sure Pilate knew this was coming. He knows that Pilate's not going to like surprises, especially unpleasant surprises. The Jews likely did not to expect Pilate to put on a trial. Luke 23, verse 2. They, the chief priests, began to accuse him, that's Jesus, saying, "We found this man," here we go, 3 charges now. "We found this man subverting our nation." Where'd that come from? Forbidding, and second, forbidding us to pay the tribute tax to Caesar. That's a bald-faced lie, because they know he said precisely, render to Caesar what is Caesar's. They probably just only took the other part, and to God what's God. And the third charge, and claiming, this is the Jews' chief priest claiming, that he himself is Christ a king. There is the key at this point so far. The fact that they said, here's the third charge, he declares that he is King of the Jews. Well, the 3 charges, all political now. He's subverting Israel, meaning he's taking Israel and he's trying to make Israel be unloyal to Caesar, unloyal with Rome. That's what I mean by subverting their nation. He's trying to divert us away from Rome. He's forbidding us to pay tribute. In other words, he says he's not recognizing Caesar's right and power and authority to tax. He's not letting Caesar's sovereignty be over Jerusalem or over Israel. And he is claiming to be the king of Israel himself. So there you are. So what are they charging with? That they don't get a specific answer, but it looks like it's either sedition, stirring up political unrest in Israel, challenging their loyalty to Rome, which was a lie. He'd never done anything politically. Refusing Caesar's sovereignty by forbidding the payment of Roman taxes, also a lie. And then Jesus claimed to be a king, which was true. But it was used here to deceive Pilate into thinking Jesus was challenging Caesar and leading an insurrection. So, 2 lies and 1 deception. And we'll deal with that last deception somewhat, at least Pilate and Jesus will. Of course, as we mentioned, those charges exactly pictured the kind of Jesus refused to be, the kind of person Jesus refused to be. Political? No. Military? No. Insurrectionist? No. He refused to be any of those. So, by the way, the charge of declaring himself the Christ is just another example proving the Jews knew Jesus claimed to be Messiah and God. They're using it. That's the one true thing they did use, but they used it in a deceptive manner. Question: what had Jesus said about Caesar and taxes? Again, we just mentioned it, and you know it. Render unto Caesar those things that are Caesar's. That's in Luke 20, verses 22 through 25. So Jesus said if it's due Caesar under his sovereignty, pay it. If it's due to God under God's sovereignty, pay it to God. Here's another question for you. We're soon going to learn that Pilate's conversation with Jesus revolved around the last charge only, being a king. Why would the Romans care that Jesus claimed to be a king? Well, because that would be a challenge to the sovereignty of Caesar. And if Jesus were the king of an earthly kingdom, that would be true. He would be challenging Caesar's sovereignty. But that's not the kind of kingdom that Jesus is speaking about, and that's going to be clear very soon. First, sedition, that's inciting rebellion. Treason, aiding enemies of the state. Insurrection, open rebellion, none of which Jesus ever aligned himself with. So the whole thing is a sham. It's a put-up simply to get Jesus executed. So where are we? It seems likely that with all the stir Jesus caused at his triumphal entry into Jerusalem, Pilate had already heard that Jesus was being called the Christ, the Anointed One, the King, and he would have known of that charge. If you go back and remember, they were talking in terms of their Messiah coming to them on a donkey. Pilate would not have been totally ignorant of all of that, folks. So he would have known that these charges are a sham. But he's got to play the game out. The claim to deity would put one in opposition to Caesar. Why is that? Because Caesar is considered divine by Rome. But now you have a guy who claims to be divine also. So that will also be, in effect, a challenge to Caesar in the minds of the Romans. Therefore, the whole indictment was a fabrication of lies and deceit based upon Jesus' single declaration of his being Messiah, man, and God as Son of God. The Jews put it together to get blasphemy, which is a death sentence, but they could not put it together easily to get a Roman death sentence, because Rome didn't care. Pilate tells the Jews to handle the problems himself. You remember that? You take care of it yourself. We'll see that in just a second. And notice that is exactly what the chief priest told Judas to do about his betrayal and the money that he wanted to give back to them, the 30 pieces of silver. The chief priest told Judas, it's your problem, you deal with it. Now look in John 18:31, see what Pilate said. Pilate told him, take him, that's Jesus, yourselves, and pass judgment on him according to your own law. In other words, you take it and deal with it according to what you will. Pilate tried to figuratively wash his hands of Jesus and this whole incident from the beginning. From the very first time he spoke with these guys, he tried to figuratively wash his hands of it. We know he'll try to physically wash his hands of it later. The leaders, however, tipped their hand as to their true intent. And this is in the last half of John 18:31 and verse 32. The Jewish leaders replied, we cannot legally put anyone to death. It wasn't exactly true, but effectively at this time, probably. This happened to fulfill the word Jesus himself had spoken when he indicated what kind of death he was going to die. Do you remember that? It was in John chapter 3, either 2 or 3, where he said, "When I'm lifted up," which is exactly what the cross will do. So even at this tense moment, however, John has reminded us of one very important thing. Jesus' death must fulfill prophecy, both Old Testament prophecy and Jesus' own prophecy. That has to happen, and it won't happen by stoning. So the Jews know they cannot leave it. Pilate can't leave it with them to do. So they wanted Jesus dead, but the Roman rule generally ruled them or rendered them powerless to do that execution. So that's where we'll leave it for this session. Isn't that terrible? Bring you right up. Say, okay, Pilate says, you take him, you do what you can with it. They said, we can't. So that's where we're leaving it. We're at the front end of the Roman trial of Jesus, the very front. We're just getting it started. We finally have an indictment. We have the list of 3 charges the Jews have made, 2 lies and 1 misleading, 1 devious. And with the Jews needing to bring, build, and prove a case against Jesus, Pilate has already made it clear he's not a rubber stamp. So they're going to have to prove their case against Jesus in such a way to bring the death penalty. Now, if Pilate wanted to cave into what they're saying, he could have quit right now and said, okay, yeah, he's a king. He's going to lead an insurrection so we can execute him as a threat to Caesar. That's not where he's going at this time. He could have, but he didn't. So we'll see you next time and see how we get on with the next piece of this first segment, is trial via interrogation. Still got those 2 big words before Jesus. Jesus and Pilate having give and take, Pilate and the Jews having give and take, and we cycle between those. How many times? Maybe as many as 4 or 5 times. But that's where we're going. We'll see you then. It ain't going to get any easier.